I came home to my daughter sitting on the front step with two garbage bags and a look on her face I will never, as long as I live, forget. Her name is Brooke. She's 12 years old. She plays travel soccer on Saturdays, and she still folds her socks into little balls the way I taught her when she was 4. She was sitting on that step in front of our building on the Upper West Side with those two black trash bags flanking her like bodyguards, and her chin was doing that thing it does when she's trying so hard not to pry that every muscle in her jaw is fighting the war by itself. I almost didn't see her. I'd been in back-to-back depositions all day. I'm a senior associate at a mid-sized firm in Midtown, contracts and real estate law, and that Tuesday had been particularly brutal. My heels were off my feet before I even hit the sidewalk. And then I saw her, and I forgot every single thing that had happened to me that day. She looked up at me and said, "Grandma Patrice told me I don't live here anymore." I remember the sound of a cab horn somewhere down Columbus Avenue. I remember the cold coming up through the pavement through my stockinged feet. I remember thinking, very clearly, the way you think when your brain is trying to protect you from what it's hearing. She must have misunderstood. She must have gotten confused. This is a 12-year-old child sitting outside her own home. So I sat down next to her, right there on that step, in my good blazer, and I said, "Tell me exactly what happened." And she did, word by word. My mother-in-law, Patrice Beaumont, had arrived that afternoon with her youngest daughter, Renee, Marcus's little sister, 26 years old, recently separated from her own husband, allegedly because of some mess in Dallas nobody would tell me about. They had arrived with a key. They had walked into my condo. They had gone into Brooke's room and told her to pack what she needed. And when Brooke asked why, Patrice told her, "Your mama doesn't own this place anymore, baby. You don't live here. Go wait outside." My daughter, 12 years old, outside on a step. The thing about Marcus Beaumont is that he has always been the most charming man in any room he walks into, and I married that charm before I understood what it was hiding. We met at a fundraiser in Georgetown 7 years ago. He was in commercial real estate development, already building a name for himself in the D.C. corridor, and I was fresh out of law school, a little drunk on ambition and exactly one glass of Prosecco. He was tall and deliberate in the way he moved, like every step was a decision he'd already made and was confident about. He laughed at my jokes. He remembered the name of the firm I'd clerked at. He called 2 days later, not 3. I thought, this man is organized in his affections. That felt like a good thing. I was 28. I didn't yet know that organized people can also be organized liars. We got married in 2019. A small ceremony in Charlottesville at a vineyard his family half-owned. His father, Harold, was quieter, a background man, the kind who says little and sees everything. I liked Harold. He died 18 months into our marriage, quietly, the way he'd lived. After that, Patrice became a woman with nothing to soften her. The condo was my idea, and that is the most important sentence in this story, though it took me 2 years to fully understand why. We were renting in DuPont Circle when I got a referral bonus big enough to use as a down payment. I'd been researching the market for months. Upper West Side, the 70s blocks, walkable to good schools, appreciating neighborhood, strong rental cap rate if we ever needed it. I found the unit, 3-bedroom, 14th floor, corner unit, asking $473,000 with HOA fees that were borderline criminal, but justifiable given the building amenities. I ran the numbers. I presented them to Marcus on a Tuesday night over dinner. He said, "Let me think about it." 2 days later, he said yes. I made the offer. I negotiated the closing costs. I hired the inspector. I drove the whole transaction from offer to keys. My name went on the deed because Marcus was mid-close on a development deal in Newark and said it was cleaner that way for his taxes. I didn't argue. It was my down payment. It made sense. We were married. What was mine was his, and what was his was ours. That's what I believed. I called Marcus from that front step while Brooke sat beside me, eating a granola bar I'd found at the bottom of my bag, and when he picked up the phone, he sounded not guilty, not panicked, measured. "Hey," that's what he said, like it was any Tuesday. "Marcus, your mother put our daughter out of the apartment with trash bags." Silence. Then, "Come upstairs, we should talk." "We should talk," he said. Not, "What?" Not, "That's insane, I'm calling her right now." He said, "We should talk," with the tone of a man who has been waiting for a conversation and now, finally, is ready to have it. I took Brooke's hand, we went upstairs, and I want you to understand something about what I walked into. It was my home, my couch, my plants, my art on the walls, my daughter's soccer trophies on the shelf. But Renee was already there, already comfortable, already in the kitchen with a glass of wine from my refrigerator, like she owned every square foot of the 14th floor. And Patrice was on my couch with her shoes off and her legs crossed and her face arranged in the specific expression she always wore when she was about to tell you you weren't going to like, as if she was doing you a kindness. Marcus came out of the bedroom, and I need you to really picture this moment because I've replayed it maybe 1,000 times since. He looked at me, he looked at his mother, he looked at his sister, and he smiled. Not a mean smile, not a guilty smile, a small, private, satisfied smile, the smile of a man who has executed a plan and is watching it land. "The house is actually," he started, and his mother and his sister went pale simultaneously, like they'd been connected to the same current and someone cut it. Because Marcus had not cleared what he was about to say with either of them, and apparently whatever it was had been agreed upon to be introduced differently, more gently, with more cushion around it, and he was going off script. "The house is actually in your name, baby. Has been the whole time. It's not something they can take from you." I stared at him. Patrice made a sound like she'd been poked. Renee set her wine glass down very carefully. "I know what my mother told Brooke. I know what she's been planning. I need you to hear it from me before she spins it." He sat down at the dining table, my dining table, the one I'd found at a vintage place in the Berkshires and hauled back in a rented truck, and he put his hands flat on the surface and he looked directly at me and said, "She's been telling the family for 6 months that I was going to have your name taken off the deed, that we were going to put Renee here while she gets back on her feet, that you'd be taken care of financially so you wouldn't make trouble. She told Renee the apartment was basically hers." The room was so quiet I could hear the building's HVAC system in the walls. "And were you," I asked, "planning to take my name off?" He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "I was going to. 6 months ago, I was going to. There are things you think you'll do when you find out the person you married was planning to take your home, and then there are the things you actually do." I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I picked up Brooke and I said, "Grab whatever you need for tonight. We're going to Aunt Dana's." And I went into the bedroom and I took my passport, my laptop, the hard drive from the desk drawer, and my grandmother's earrings from the jewelry box, and I walked back out through the living room where 3 Beaumonts sat in various stages of damage control, and I said to Patrice, clearly and without heat, "I want you out of my apartment before I get back." I did not wait for a response. I took my daughter down the elevator and out into the November air, and I called my best friend, Dana, who lived in Brooklyn, and while the phone rang, I was already making a list in my head, not of things to pack, not of things to cry about later, a list of what I knew and what I needed to find out, and what I was going to do with all of it. Because here's what nobody in that room understood about me. I'm a contracts attorney. I spend 40 hours a week finding what's buried in documents. I know how property law works in the state of New York. I know what a deed says and what it doesn't say, and what it can and cannot do. And I had 6 months of not knowing to catch up on, and I intended to catch up fast. The first thing I did at Dana's apartment, after Brooke was asleep on the pullout, and Dana had made us both tea, neither of us was drinking, was open my laptop and pull up every financial document I had access to. Marcus and I had kept mostly separate finances. His idea, which I had accepted as practical given that we had different income structures, different tax situations, different professional liabilities. We had a joint account for household expenses, but our individual accounts, our investments, our lines of credit, those were separate. It had always seemed sensible. It was designed to seem sensible. The genius of a long con is that none of the individual pieces look like a con until you lay them all side by side. I laid them side by side. I started with the joint account and worked outward. Dana sat across from me with her own laptop, and we worked until 2 in the morning, and by the time I went to sleep, I knew 3 things I hadn't known that morning. Marcus had a second LLC I'd never heard of, registered in Delaware 8 months ago. The LLC had made several large transactions with a property management company in Newark that had, as far as I could tell, nothing to do with any deal he'd ever mentioned to me. And someone had requested a quote 6 months ago. The timestamp was there in an email I found forwarded to our joint account by accident, probably a mistake on whoever sent it, from a real estate attorney in Queens about the process of removing a co-owner's name from a deed in cases of marital separation. He hadn't just been thinking about it. He had started the paperwork. He'd stopped, and I didn't know why he had stopped, and for a few days I was almost more unsettled by that than by anything else. Why do you put the machine in motion and then let it sit? I turned that question over for a week. I kept working. I pulled everything I could find on the Delaware LLC. I called a forensic accountant I'd referred clients to before, a woman named Cynthia who worked out of a midtown office and had the energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed finding where money went to hide. I also did something that felt almost too obvious to work. I filed a simple public records request on the Newark property transactions, and I waited. Meanwhile, Marcus called me every day. Not frantic calls, not desperate calls, careful, measured calls, the same register he used in that first conversation when I came home to my daughter on the step. He said he wanted to explain. He said things had gotten complicated. He said his family had overstepped. He said Patrice made promises to Renee he hadn't authorized. I listened to all of it. I said, okay, let's talk more when I've had some space. I was professionally trained not to show my hand. He thought I was processing. I was building a file. Marcus called a fair on a Thursday afternoon 2.5 weeks after I'd brought Cynthia in, and she called me at my desk and said, Nadia, honey, you should come in. I'm Nadia, by the way, Nadia Voss Beaumont. I'd kept my own name professionally and added his for the marriage certificate, which meant professionally I was still Nadia Voss, which would turn out to matter. Cynthia laid it out for me across her conference table with the calm of a surgeon. The LLC, it was called Emerald Stack Holdings, which is the kind of name that tries to sound bigger than it is, had been funded in part with money that originated in our joint household account, routed through 3 intermediaries. The total amount that had moved was just over $200,000 over 18 months. The property management company in Newark was, it turned out, not a property management company in any real sense. It was a holding entity, and the beneficial owner of that holding entity, the person who received the income from it, was a woman named Cassandra Ossie, 29 years old, a project manager Marcus had worked with on a development in the Ironbound neighborhood starting about 2 years ago. He had built her a business with my money. I sat in that conference room for a very long time after Cynthia stopped talking. I looked at the papers, I looked at the numbers, I looked at the name, and I thought about Brooke sitting on that front step with her soccer cleats sticking out of a garbage bag, and I thought about Patrice on my couch with her shoes off like she'd already won, and I thought about Marcus saying with that small, satisfied smile, "The house is actually—" I picked up my pen and I started writing. I want to be specific about something because I've had people ask me since, did I want to destroy him? And the honest answer is no. Destruction is imprecise. It catches innocent things in the radius. Brooke would have to live with whatever I did for the rest of her life. I didn't want destruction. I wanted accuracy. I wanted every consequence to land on exactly the person who earned it and on no one else. That requires planning. That requires patience. That requires being willing to sit in the discomfort of not acting while you're still gathering information. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been a woman standing on a sidewalk with her shoes off, trying to understand what was happening to her life. By the time I was done in Cynthia's office, I was something else. I was an attorney who had a client. The client was me, and I knew exactly what remedies were available. The first move was the most important, and it was the quietest. I had been working, during those 3 weeks of evidence gathering, with my own attorney, not a colleague, not someone connected to my firm, but a woman named Pilar Reyes, who worked family and matrimonial law out of an office on Lexington Avenue and had a reputation for being brilliantly methodical and completely without mercy. I had shared with Pilar the timeline, the financials, the LLC, all of it. Pilar had filed, discreetly, a notice of pendency on the condo, a document that doesn't require Marcus's knowledge or signature, that simply attaches to the property record and prevents any transfer or refinancing without court approval. The apartment wasn't going anywhere. If he had in fact been planning to take my name off the deed, he had missed his window by the width of a morning. The door had closed. The second move was for Patrice, and this one had a particular kind of satisfaction to it because it used her own behavior as the instrument. When Patrice told my 12-year-old daughter she didn't live in her home anymore and had her pack her belongings and wait outside, she committed several things simultaneously. She committed, legally, what New York recognizes as interference with parental custody. I was Brooke's residential parent. She also, in her zeal, sent a text message to her son Marcus that afternoon that said, in part, "It's done. She can come home to a surprise." That text was in the thread on Marcus's phone, which I had access to because he used our shared family plan, and which I had screen captured before I left the apartment that night. Pilar had that text. My documentation of Brooke's experience, her account, written with her permission and in language a 12-year-old used naturally, was part of the file. I filed a formal complaint with family court, not to punish Patrice per se, but to create a record that would matter in the custody proceedings that were now, inevitably, coming. The third move was for Renee, who was, I want to be fair, probably more victim than architect. She'd been told something was already settled and had moved accordingly, but she had still walked into my home with a key she had no right to ask and drunk my wine and watched my child be put on the street. Pilar sent a formal letter to the building's management company noting that an unauthorized individual had accessed Unit 14C using a key provided by a joint tenant for purposes not authorized by the deed holder, and requesting that the building flag any future requests from non-residents for additional keys or fob access to the unit. It was clean, it was civil, it communicated clearly that the building's liability exposure in this situation was something they should consider carefully. Renee was out of the apartment within 48 hours. The fourth move was for Marcus, and it was not legal, it was personal, and it was the one I took the most time with. Marcus worked in commercial real estate development. His professional reputation, his relationships with investors, with lenders, with the kind of old money families who move quietly in New York development circles, was the engine of everything he had. It was how he funded deals. It was how he got introductions. It was how he had, apparently, been able to build an entire parallel financial life without me noticing, because people trusted him, and he leveraged that trust carefully and continuously. I did not go to his investors. I did not call his lenders. I did not do anything that would constitute tortious interference with his business because I was not interested in a countersuit, and I was not interested in doing something I'd be embarrassed to explain to Brooke when she was older. What I did was more contained and more permanent. I called Marcus's most important business partner, a man named Gerald Fitzwilliam, who ran a private equity firm in the Flatiron District and who had co-signed on 2 of Marcus's largest current projects, and I asked for a meeting. Not on behalf of myself, on behalf of the Emerald Stack LLC matter, which I framed accurately as a potential fiduciary complication that Gerald might want to be aware of before his name appeared on any additional documents connected to Marcus's network of entities. Gerald was 53 years old, and he survived the 2008 collapse by being pathologically careful. He took the meeting in under an hour of being asked. I presented the financials. I presented the LLC structure. I presented the paper trail showing the origin of the funding. I said nothing about the affair, nothing about the woman, nothing personal. I talked numbers. I talked fiduciary. Gerald's face did the rest. By the end of the week, Gerald had quietly withdrawn from one of the two projects and requested an audit on the other. Marcus's phone started ringing in a new way. I know because Brooke was at the apartment for a scheduled dinner and she texted me, "Dad seems stressed." Good. Marcus requested mediation in December, 11 weeks after Brooke sat on that front step. He showed up with a divorce attorney from a white shoe firm on Park Avenue. The expensive kind. The kind you hire when you think there's something to protect. I showed up with Pilar. We sat across a long table in a midtown mediation suite, and the mediator, a retired judge named Alvin Kaufman, who had the energy of a man who had heard every story twice already, asked us to outline our respective positions. Marcus's attorney opened with a framework I recognized immediately. He was going to argue that the condo, despite being solely in my name, had been funded through marital income and should be treated as marital property subject to equitable distribution. It was a reasonable argument. It was also the argument I had been waiting for, because equitable distribution in New York requires both parties to disclose all assets, including, for example, the assets held in a Delaware LLC, including, for example, the income stream flowing to a woman in Newark that had originated in joint funds. I looked at Marcus's attorney while he was talking, and I saw the moment. It was subtle, just a slight shift in his posture, when he registered that I wasn't worried, that I was listening to him with professional interest and no fear whatsoever. He had not been told everything. Marcus had not given him the full picture. You can't, ethically, walk into equitable distribution discovery and have that kind of exposure undisclosed. The attorney glanced at Marcus. Marcus was looking at the table. Pilar opened her folder and said, very calmly, "We'd like to introduce into the record the following documentation regarding marital assets not previously disclosed by Mr. Beaumont." Marcus's attorney asked for a recess. He got one. They went into the hallway. Through the glass, I could see him talking to Marcus with the low, contained urgency of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about his client's case. When they came back in, the framework had changed, substantially. The settlement took 3 more months. By the time it was signed, I kept the condo outright. No offset, no buyout, because the court-approved evaluation of what Marcus had moved through marital funds into his undisclosed LLC effectively neutralized his equity claim. He got his Newark venture, such as it was at this point, and the deal in Newark that hadn't fully collapsed yet, and a payment schedule on the remainder of the assessed diversion that would keep him honest for the next 4 years. Brooke had a primary residence with me, school of her choosing, schedule that gave her real time with both parents. I did not ask for anything punitive in the custody arrangement, because punitive wasn't the point. Security was the point, stability, her socks and little balls on the shelf. What happened to Patrice? Nothing, legally. The court record exists. The complaint exists. She knows it exists. She knows that if she ever again takes any action in relation to my daughter that resembles what she did on that November afternoon, that record becomes the beginning of a much longer story. She has not come to the building since February. She has not sent a text to Brooke that I'm aware of. She has, as far as I can tell, redirected her considerable energy toward Renee's situation in Dallas, which is apparently genuinely complicated. I hope she finds something useful to do with herself. I genuinely do. That's not sarcasm. Hatred is expensive, and I'm not paying for it. What happened to Renee? She got an apartment in Hoboken using money from Marcus's share of the settlement. She and I have not spoken. That's fine. Some silences are clean. What happened to Patrice Osei? I don't know, and I didn't look. She was 29 years old and she built something, and someone used her to hide money, and that is a story between her and Marcus and whatever's left of their arrangement now that the arrangement's architecture has been laid open in a mediator suite on Park Avenue. I hope she got a good attorney. Last Saturday, Brooke had a tournament in Riverside Park, the turf fields down by the highway. You can hear the West Side Highway underneath everything like a pulse. It was cold, that particular New York cold that comes in March before it decides to commit to spring, and I was on the sideline in my coat with a coffee that had gone lukewarm, and I was watching her play. And she scored in the second half, a clean left footer from the top of the backs, and she wheeled around toward the sideline with her arms out, and she found my face in the small crowd, and she grinned. Not a relieved grin, not an anxious one. Not the grin of a girl who sat on a front step in November with everything she owned in garbage bags, while the adults in her life decided who she belonged to. Just a grin. The pure, uncomplicated soccer goal kind. The kind that is only possible when a kid feels safe enough to just exist in the moment, without anything underneath it. That's what I was playing for. The apartment is very quiet now in the mornings before she wakes up. I make coffee and I look out at the park from the 14th floor, and I think about all the decisions I made, the good ones and the ones that cost me sleep. And I think about what it means to hold on to something that's yours, not out of spite, not out of pride, but because it's a home, because a 12-year-old girl needs to come in from school and put her bag on the hook by the door and know that hook will be there tomorrow. Because that matters more than being graceful about any of this. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to lose. I signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday, the same day of the week I'd come home to her on that step. I didn't plan it that way, but when I noticed the date, I kept the pen a little longer than I needed to, and I felt, for the first time in months, something light moved through my chest. Not happiness exactly, solidity. The feeling of ground under your feet that doesn't shift when you step on it. The feeling of a door that locks from the inside properly and the key is in your hand. Marcus can keep the charm. He can keep the smile. He can keep the room he walks into and the way he commands it. I kept the condo. I kept my daughter. I kept my name, Nadia Voss, the way it appears on my office door, the way it appeared on the deed the whole time, the way it will appear on whatever comes next. I kept the view from the 14th floor. I kept the couch and the plants and the art and the trophies on the shelf. I kept everything that was mine to keep. And every morning I make my coffee and I look out at the park and I think, let them come up with a plan for this.